General Hospital will reveal. As everything around him grew increasingly chaotic and obscure, Jason began to sense that the pieces of a much larger puzzle were finally starting to fall into place. No longer did he see the events unfolding as disconnected incidents. Each strange encounter, each vague warning, every subtle shift in behavior, these weren't coincidences. They were calculated movements in a carefully constructed web, and at the center of that web stood one man, Siwell. Known publicly as a polished, powerful figure with the aura of a respected businessman, Siwell's reputation had always been accompanied by faint whispers of criminal ties. But Jason's instincts told him those whispers were far more than idle speculation. And soon enough, his investigation confirmed it. Siwell wasn't just a shadowy figure operating from behind the curtain. He was the mastermind of a quiet but dangerous network of manipulation, using those closest to his enemies as pawns in a dark game of control. What shocked Jason most was the discovery of Siwell's own son, Marco, being used as a key piece in this twisted scheme. Marco, a promising young attorney with a spotless reputation, had come to Port Charles under the guise of representing Drew in upcoming legal battles. At first, his presence seemed benign, timely, even helpful. But Jason, never one to trust easily, noticed too many oddities. The sudden drop of Marco's credit card in Miami. His seemingly random decision to visit Windermere. His immediate and intense connection with Lucas. None of it sat right with Jason. The deeper he dug, the clearer the truth became. Marco's arrival wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. Siwell, aware that Marco was gay and that Lucas had recently suffered emotional wounds, devised a plan that blurred the line between manipulation and cruelty. He sent Marco to seduce Lucas, using his son's genuine feelings as a weapon to infiltrate the inner circle surrounding Carly and Jason. Lucas, sensitive and compassionate, was an easy target. Still healing from past heartbreak, he welcomed Marco's attention with open arms, completely unaware that his heart was being used as leverage in someone else's war. Jason watched helplessly as Lucas became more entangled in the relationship, blinded by the comfort he found in Marco's company. But the more he observed, the more determined Jason became to uncover the truth. He tracked Marco's movements, intercepted encrypted messages, and eventually connected the dots between his meetings with Siwell and a series of calculated actions aimed at destabilizing those closest to Jason. Marco, whether knowingly or not, had become a tool in his father's larger ambition, to infiltrate, disrupt, and destroy. Jason's anger deepened when he realized that Marco wasn't just being used, he was being sacrificed. Siwell showed no concern for the emotional damage being done to either his son or Lucas. To him, relationships were resources. Love, loyalty, vulnerability, these were means to an end. The fact that Marco may have truly developed feelings for Lucas only made the betrayal more tragic. Jason saw in Marco a man torn between obligation and authenticity, between the role forced upon him and the love he might actually feel. But Siwell didn't care. He had planted his son like a ticking time bomb, waiting for the moment to detonate when it would cause the most damage. With this horrifying truth in hand, Jason knew he had to act. But he also knew he had to be smart. One wrong move and Siwell could vanish, taking his secrets with him. Worse, Marco could be discarded, or destroyed, by the very man who had orchestrated the entire scheme. Jason needed to strike at the right time, and with precision. His mission was no longer just about protecting Carly or uncovering the truth about Jack Brennan. It had become a crusade to save Lucas from heartbreak, to pull Marco from the jaws of his father's influence, and to dismantle the machinery Siwell had built so carefully over the years. At the same time, Jason couldn't ignore how dangerous the game had become. Siwell was not a man who played lightly. Every move Jason made now would be countered by someone who had already anticipated opposition. The lines between friend and foe, truth and illusion, loyalty and betrayal were all beginning to blur. But Jason had survived far worse. With his unshakable resolve, he prepared for what lay ahead, not just to win, but to ensure that Siwell's empire of deceit would crumble, and that the people he cared about would no longer be pawns in someone else's ruthless game. Marco, a promising young attorney with a gleaming future ahead of him, arrived in Port Charles wearing the mask of a hero. On the surface, he was everything the town needed, a sharp legal mind, untainted by scandal, stepping in at a crucial moment to represent Drew in a high-stakes legal battle. His presence was met with optimism and trust. People viewed Marco as an outsider bringing integrity and strength to a community increasingly shaken by secrets, danger, and betrayal. But what no one realized, what was masterfully hidden beneath Marco's charming demeanor and noble intentions, was that his arrival had been meticulously planned long before the first court date was even set. Behind the scenes, the true architect of Marco's sudden involvement was none other than Siwell, a man whose ability to manipulate from the shadows had become his most dangerous skill. While the world saw a father sending his accomplished son to offer legal aid, Jason would later uncover the chilling truth. Marco was a pawn, carefully positioned on a chessboard crafted by a man with far more sinister motives. Siwell had spent years mastering the art of emotional exploitation. He didn't just rely on force or blackmail. He understood the deeper, quieter weaknesses of the people around him. He understood how to target vulnerability with precision. And in Lucas, he saw a perfect opportunity. Lucas, known for his compassionate nature and history of heartbreak, had always carried a softness, an openness that, in the right hands, could be nurtured into something beautiful. But in the wrong hands, like Siwell's, it could be turned into a weapon. What made the situation even more devastating was that Siwell used his own son's truth as a strategic advantage. He knew Marco was gay. He also knew that Marco had spent most of his life seeking emotional connection, belonging, and the freedom to love openly. That very desire for authenticity, something so personal, so sacred, became a tool in Siwell's arsenal. He didn't ask for Marco's consent. He didn't care how deeply Marco might get involved or whether feelings would emerge. All he cared about was getting close enough to Lucas to infiltrate the network of trust that surrounded Carly and Jason. Marco's assignment was subtle, but clear: charm Lucas, get close to him, earn his affection, and then use that emotional access to gather information, manipulate perceptions, and, if necessary, destabilize relationships. It was an elegant form of sabotage, quiet and devastating. No one would suspect that a budding romance could be part of a much larger conspiracy. Siwell had weaponized love itself. To those who didn't know the full story, Marco's connection with Lucas looked natural, even serendipitous. They met under circumstances that felt organic, bonded over shared values, and quickly grew close. Lucas, desperate to believe in love again, welcomed Marco into his life with open arms. He saw in Marco someone sincere, someone safe. But what Lucas couldn't see, what Jason would later uncover, was the truth hidden behind every kind gesture and every intimate moment. Marco had been sent with a purpose, and that purpose had nothing to do with love. The tragedy was that Marco may not have fully understood the depth of his father's manipulation. He might have believed he could walk the line, follow orders without crossing moral boundaries. But emotions are never so easily controlled. Whether Marco was coerced or blindly loyal, the result was the same. Lucas had been drawn into a false sense of security, and Siwell had gained a foothold into the emotional core of Jason's world. Jason, always alert to subtle threats, began to sense that something was wrong. He noticed how quickly Marco and Lucas had bonded, how Marco seemed to know just the right things to say, how his arrival conveniently aligned with several quiet shifts in strategy behind closed doors. The more he investigated, the clearer it became: Marco's presence wasn't just about Drew's legal defense. It was part of an elaborate operation designed to undermine Jason and Carly from the inside, by first targeting the people they loved most. What made it all the more infuriating was how deeply personal Siwell's tactics had become. He hadn't just inserted a spy into the lives of his enemies, he had manipulated his own son's identity, weaponized his sexuality, and preyed on the genuine affection forming between Marco and Lucas. It was a level of psychological warfare that crossed every imaginable line. Now, Jason was faced with a dilemma as complex as it was urgent. He needed to expose Siwell and stop the infiltration before more damage was done. But doing so meant potentially destroying the fragile trust Lucas had placed in Marco, and possibly breaking the heart of a man who, despite being used, might have genuinely fallen for Lucas. It was a tightrope walk between truth and destruction, between justice and collateral damage. In the end, Jason knew one thing for certain: Siwell had miscalculated. He believed emotions could be controlled like chess pieces, that love could be engineered and sacrificed for power. But Jason also knew that real love, once manipulated, had a way of revealing the rot at the core of every lie. And he was determined to drag every hidden truth into the light, no matter the cost. Lucas, with his gentle heart and deep yearning to be loved, walked blindly into a web of emotional manipulation he could never have anticipated. Having endured his fair share of heartbreak and disillusionment in the past, Lucas had finally begun to believe he might be worthy of something real again, something tender, something honest. So when Marco entered his life, seemingly by chance, with warmth in his smile and empathy in his eyes, Lucas allowed himself to hope. He welcomed the connection with open arms, seeing Marco not only as a potential partner, but as a kindred spirit, someone who understood him on a deeper level. The chemistry between them felt undeniable, and the comfort Marco offered seemed genuine. Lucas had no reason to suspect that beneath the surface of their growing intimacy was a carefully constructed plan designed to exploit his vulnerability. Every soft moment they shared, every lingering glance, every heartfelt conversation, was, in Lucas's mind, a step toward healing. He was falling, perhaps too quickly, but it felt safe. He didn't question Marco's intentions, nor did he detect the shadows that lurked behind the carefully crafted facade. Marco played his role perfectly. If there was guilt within him, he buried it under layers of charm and carefully timed displays of affection. He knew exactly what Lucas needed to hear, exactly how to appear invested without ever giving too much of himself away. And it worked. Lucas fell deeper, unaware that the foundation of their relationship had been poisoned from the start. But while Lucas remained lost in this emotional haze, Jason's instincts began to stir. Unlike Lucas, Jason saw the world through a much more calculated lens. He had learned, often the hard way, that trust was fragile and that danger rarely announced itself with a warning. At first, it was only a subtle sense of unease. Jason couldn't quite explain it, but there was something about Marco's timing that didn't sit right with him. His sudden arrival, his proximity to Lucas, and the speed with which their relationship escalated, everything felt a little too convenient. Jason now faced the painful dilemma of exposing the truth without completely destroying Lucas in the process. How could he tell his friend that the man he had let into his heart was never meant to stay, that his relationship had been orchestrated by a man who saw emotions as tools for manipulation? And yet, Jason knew he had no choice. The longer he waited, the deeper Lucas would fall, and the greater the damage would be once the truth surfaced. Marco, in all of this, remained an enigma. Was he merely following orders, caught in the crosshairs of a powerful father's agenda? Or had he started to feel something real for Lucas, complicating the mission and putting himself at risk? Jason couldn't yet tell, but it didn't change the fact that Marco was a strategic asset in Siwell's greater plan. A plan designed not just to reach Lucas, but to destabilize everything stable and secure surrounding Carly. And so, as Jason stood on the edge of exposing the lie, he knew that what came next wouldn't just be a confrontation. It would be a reckoning, one where love, betrayal, and power collided in the most personal way imaginable. That level of exploitation was unforgivable in Jason's eyes. It ignited something fierce within him, something protective and unrelenting. The need to protect those he loved no longer came from strategy or loyalty alone, it came from a raw, visceral place. He saw now how deeply the corruption ran, and he would not allow it to spread further. With that resolve, Jason made his way to the Port Charles Police Department, not to request answers, but to demand them. The moment Lucas stepped into Carly's hospital room, the emotions he had tried to contain came rushing to the surface. He sat by her bedside, consumed by anger and confusion. He blamed Brennan. To Lucas, it was obvious, Brennan was the one who had dragged danger to Carly's doorstep. He expressed his frustration, desperate for validation. But Carly's response left him stunned. Her voice was calm, almost detached, as she looked at him with that steady gaze he had always known. Jack Brennan didn't do this, she told him. Valentine did. Lucas stared at her, disoriented by the certainty in her tone. He wanted to argue, but the conviction in Carly's words silenced him. She wasn't confused. She wasn't emotional. She was clear-headed, and she was sure. Brennan, she insisted, was being used as a scapegoat. The true threat was Valentine and the network of power brokers surrounding him, including Siwell. She believed Brennan was caught in the middle, perhaps even manipulated in his own right. Lucas sat back in his chair, reeling. If what Carly said was true, then everything he thought he knew was incomplete, maybe even wrong. He began to see that the situation wasn't just about isolated betrayals or dangerous alliances. It was a system, a hidden network of powerful men shaping outcomes from the shadows. Love was being traded as currency. Trust was weaponized. Identities were manipulated. Lucas realized he was only beginning to glimpse the full scale of the rot beneath the surface. His mother's clarity disturbed him, not because it lacked truth, but because it hinted at just how deep this darkness went. Carly's face, though pale from recovery, was resolute. Her belief in Brennan's innocence wasn't naivety, it was insight. And Lucas, who had spent days resenting Brennan and mourning the destruction in his personal life, suddenly felt like a child who had wandered too close to the fire without understanding the heat. Outside that hospital room, the war was already underway. Jason was rallying forces, peeling back layers of deception with increasing determination. Each piece of the puzzle he uncovered brought him closer to the truth, and closer to the confrontation with Siwell he knew was inevitable. But he also understood that truth had a cost. Hearts would be broken. Loyalties would shatter. And some damage might be irreversible. Still, he pressed forward. Because Jason knew that in a world where power was abused, love exploited, and identities controlled, silence was complicity. And as long as Siwell's reach continued to spread, no one, not Lucas, not Carly, not even Marco, would be truly safe.